Good afternoon. I'm Tino Cuellar, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. For over 114 years, we have existed to reduce conflict, improve governance, reduce the risk of war using relationships, knowledge, information, insights, impartial analysis. We do that through our reports, we do that through our research, we do that through speakers like Robert Gates, Condi Rice, and our speaker today. I am delighted to report that as we continue on this journey, we try our best to take on the issues that are most challenging for the world. For many of you listening or watching this in the room, you probably remember the first day you voted. You probably remember the first day, or maybe you don't remember, but I certainly do, the first day as a kid that I touched the newspaper. And to think about how these two things come together, how democracies, how different organizations, governments, institutions make judgments, make decisions about how to interpret the world, ends up having an outsized effect on conflict, cooperation, governance, and peace. What we try to do as we take on these issues of how information flows, how impartial decision-making can take place, is to bring to that set of questions the careful and close analysis that you would expect from our scholars. They hug the problem. They do their best not to simply stay at 50, 60,000 feet, but to try to understand through case studies, through empirical information, through historical analysis, through trying to marshal the best information possible, what the world is really facing and what to do about it. It is with that spirit in mind that John Bateman, one of our top scholars in our tech program, has been working with a co-author on a report that we'll be discussing as part of the basis of the event today. And I would say that John and his co-author have taken great pains to make this discussion of disinformation in the report fact-based, neutral, grounded in case studies, going deep on issues like local news, like fact-checking. What does that do? Strategies to try to alert the public sometimes when some fact might be wrong. But also, I would add, they're honest. They're honest about how difficult it is even to define disinformation. And as the world continues to face elections, choices for public officials and for the public around the world, we think that it's important for this topic to get the information that it deserves, but also the careful treatment that our scholars can give it. Today, we're delighted to have John in conversation with somebody who has navigated the world of information over the years, Katherine Maher, who was the CEO of Wikimedia and has had a distinguished career in international issues, in media, and is now the CEO of National Public Radio. So as we continue to do this work and try our best to bring information and analysis to a very difficult set of issues, please welcome Katherine and John, who will be in conversation for the next hour.
Great. Thank you so much, Tino, for that kind introduction. Katherine, welcome to Carnegie. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Let me just make two brief opening comments, and I really want to dig into this conversation because there's so much here that we can talk about at the intersection of technology, journalism, disinformation, things that have been central to your career. I think the first comment I always want to make on this topic is about the term disinformation, because I think for many, it can be a stumbling block or a barrier to conversation. I always say I use this term begrudgingly. It's in the title of the event, and it does capture something important about the state of public conversation today and malicious falsehoods that are being spread with the intent to deceive. It's a serious problem. And yet, also, it can be very hard to define what disinformation is. That's the lifeblood of democracy, is arguing about what's true and false. And so we need to be careful about the overuse of that term. It can be a term of abuse, a catch-all, can be used as an excuse to censor, shut down, or seize control of conversations. And so I know, Katherine, that you've thought about these issues in your career, and that in this conversation, we're going to cover everything from the fracturing of the media landscape to the role of disruptive technologies like generative AI. And so just to kind of set the table there for the audience. The other comment I wanted to make just at the outset is about how this event all came together. And this is, if I'm not mistaken, your fourth week on the job. That's right. Yes. So congratulations. And it's been a fun week, as I gather. And The timeline for this event, we actually started planning this even before you had your first day because we wanted to have this high-level conversation. And what we didn't know is that by the time this event arose, NPR itself would become part of an important and sometimes heated public conversation about truth and objectivity in the news media. And so we are going to talk about that today. But before we do that, I'm mindful of the fact that this is actually your first public event since being named for this role. And so maybe just an introduction from you to the world is in order here. We heard a little bit about your background from Tino. You came from the tech world, you've done other things, but what led you to the role of leading National Public Radio at this moment? Why this person for this role? What felt right about this move for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me here. It is really a pleasure to be able to be in conversation with you on such an important issue. I think that if you look at my background and the time that I spent at Wikimedia, one of the things that was absolutely fundamental to the work we did there and the work that Wikimedia continues to do is it provides a model for bringing people together to engage in discourse in order to find consensus about what's known about the world today. And actually, one of the things that's so remarkable about that model is that the more people participate in Wikimedia, the more neutral their participation becomes, the more engaged they are, and the more constructive they are as participants. And in a moment where we're talking so much about, I think, the polarization of the discourse, it's about the opportunities that allow people to come together to find common understanding and shared points of view and a basis for conversation that's so exciting. What I loved about that role and how that leads into NPR is that we provided that service on behalf of everyone. That was a service for the public. It was broadly loved, it was broadly trusted, and I think that that's really important. It is about offering an organization's mission and mandate that is about serving a very wide audience and understanding what it is that you need to do to serve that audience effectively. Coming into NPR, I mean, some of the commitments that we have around upholding the importance of freedom of expression, upholding the importance of people to be able to participate and share their views, representing those views widely in such a way that people can connect with them and understand one another better. Having a strong line of integrity between the newsroom operations in NPR and management, or the editorial perspectives of Wikipedians and management. These are all very consistent things relative to my experience. I think that the other piece that I'm really excited about is how do you grow the audience, right? That was a big piece of what I did in my last role, was thinking about how do we ensure that we're serving more people, what's missing in our service. And as we look at NPR, which has a public trust and a public mandate to serve all Americans, it's a thing that I'm incredibly excited about, is how do we intensify our service there so that we are really thinking about, of the 99% of the country that we currently reach, how are we serving Americans best everywhere they are, regardless of where they come from, regardless of where they live, what background, what community that they're in.
Thanks for that. And I will say, and I should have said at the outset, we are going to be taking audience questions later toward the end. So for those of you in the room, there should be a QR code at your seats that you can use to submit those questions. So it's not too early to do that. Feel free to start submitting questions or thinking about your questions, and we will get to those. I wonder, Katherine, if you could just say a quick word about what exactly does the CEO of NPR do? So when you've been described in news articles recently, sometimes people will say you're not actually an editor or directly involved in the editorial process. For an average news consumer or citizen who's not deep in the weeds of a media enterprise, what does that mean? And what is it that you actually do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, week 4, right?
Yeah,
so,
right.
The answer is that the NPR is a remarkable journalistic institution in many ways, including having robust standards and practice, standards and practice, editing practice. We have our guidelines around our editorial policies are made public, and that is all completely independent of the CEO. The newsroom is entirely independent. There is no relationship between what we cover and what the CEO does. That is all set by our editor-in-chief. My responsibility as the CEO is to ensure that we have the resources to do this work, that we have the strategy that's set out to meet the needs of our public mandate and that public trust, to be an advocate on behalf of the importance of journalistic integrity and independence. This country has an incredible, long-lasting commitment to the freedom of the press, and as an organization in the public trust to America, not only do we have a mandate to serve all Americans, but also to uphold the independence of the press as part of our mission. And so it's about directing resources to that, ensuring that we are upholding that, and otherwise I let the journalists be the journalists and our editors be our editors, because that is what they do, and there's a very strong line between us.
And I think just maybe one point that I'll make here is that NPR is also unique among media organizations in that it's a member organization comprised in part of these local member stations. And our research here at Carnegie on what actually helps to build civic trust, fight disinformation, and generally improve the state of public conversations, investing in local media, we've actually found to be one of the most likely effective interventions, although it's extremely costly. And we're going to get into some of those financial challenges.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about that.
I think it might be helpful to talk now about some of the events of the past week or two. Many people will have seen an essay published by now former senior editor at NPR, Uri Berliner. And the crux of the essay is that he argues that NPR has lost its culture of curiosity. And that formerly it was a place that had lots of differing views and was able to draw upon that in the framing and investigation and exploration and storytelling around key media events. And then now Berliner argued that the culture of NPR has shifted toward the embrace of a progressive worldview. Now you and NPR leadership have very publicly pushed back on that, but I just want to give you the opportunity now to respond to that claim about a loss of a culture of curiosity. You're just a few weeks into the job, but what are you seeing and what's your assessment of that claim?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, because of this dividing line, this firewall between editorial and management, I don't sit in our newsroom discussions. I know that, though, in walking around the building, the editors and the journalists that I have met have been absolutely rigorous and committed to upholding a strong culture of inquiry. And this is exactly why we have the facility of the newsroom and we have editorial meetings to engage in these conversations. I think the other sort of interesting piece of this is that we've done this great research. We've been out there over the course of the last year trying to understand better how we serve the American public. And so we have been doing qualitative and quantitative research that reaches into every corner of America. We talk to people from every demographic, every background, every political belief in order to understand what do they need out of public media? What do they need out of their information ecosystem? What's important to them in the news? And the cross-cutting line for all of our listeners when we have these conversations, whether they listen or not, is that they're curious. And so a newsroom that is curious serves an audience that is curious. And that curiosity is something that's incredibly consistent across every demographic. It allows us an opportunity to have a conversation with the American public about what is interesting to them. They're open-minded. They want to understand the world around them. They want to listen to the stories that our NPR journalists tell about the world, help illuminate what's going on, help inform. They have a really interestingly, they're much more interested in how the news affects them than sort of like the covering of what goes on in Washington, which makes complete sense when you think about the role that journalism plays in their lives and in everyone's life. It's really about, what does this mean for me? How do I understand the world? How do I understand people around me? And so I think that through line of curiosity is just so promising, because if we uphold that commitment as a newsroom to curiosity and we bring people in with differing perspectives, it allows us to be curious with one another. It allows us to be curious about the world around us, and it allows us to serve that audience, which is all of America, so much better.
So I think one of the unfortunate things that we've seen in the United States and a lot of democracies is a kind of fracturing of audiences and a fracturing of trust around media, right? So more and more of us are moving toward listening to media voices and outlets that we personally trust, and then we might distrust others on the other side of some dividing line. And so if that's right, then some people watching this online or here in the room are going to have differing reactions to the confidence that you have in the quality of NPR journalism. Some people will say, yes, of course, I listen to NPR, I trust it, it actually is curious. Others will have a different view, right? And I think it's worth saying that we're actually in a moment in the public conversation where there are bad faith attacks as well. There's people who actually have a financial and political incentive and see a business opportunity or a personal opportunity in discrediting the media. But there's another camp of people who genuinely just don't trust mainstream media organizations in general, including perhaps NPR specifically. They're not in the room where these decisions are made. They're not in the story sessions. And so when they hear a leader like you, they might be asking, what's the data or the objective facts that you can cite to show that everything is legitimate, that there is curiosity, there is diversity of perspectives? Is this something that you guys internally track and try to follow and expose to the public? Or how do you think about that as a leader?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. And one thing that I learned in my time at Wikipedia is that actually we don't starting from an assumption that you're trusted comes from a place of confidence in an institution, and an institution that serves the public, and an institution that serves a public interest mandate, particularly one around information, should always start from the perspective that we have to earn the trust of the public. Now, NPR is in a really interesting position. There's some really great research and some that has actually just come out that finds that among people who know who we are actually among the most trusted media organizations in the country. Not as many people perhaps know of us as some of the bigger brand names, but the people who do know about us, and there are more than 40 million people who actively participate in consuming our news and our journalism and our programming. So it's a really big percentage of the country in terms of audiences. It's actually one of the larger ones, particularly for a daily broadcast organization. They trust us very highly. And I think that understanding that the public trust is not automatic, it doesn't come by virtue of being a media organization, it's something we earn day in and day out with the credibility of our organization, means that I don't want to fall back on statistics. I want to make sure that every person who listens to us, every person that reads the work that we do, is judging for themselves about whether to have confidence in what we do, because that's something that we owe the public, it's something that we owe their confidence, is having a real respect for their ability to discern and decide.
I think zooming out a little bit and thinking about the larger media landscape and some of the forces that are shaping not only NPR, but other journalistic outlets. I think a lot of outlets have found themselves in this paradoxical situation where it's financially difficult to operate a successful media enterprise today, especially doing hard news journalism. We've seen lots of outlets close, new startups fail. There's a shift of resources going to digital advertising, social media, shift of attention and eyeballs. And so then perhaps the only seemingly tried and true strategy for financial sustainability for a lot of media outlets is to cultivate a core, loyal niche audience. And that could be done on the grounds of partisan affiliation or on other grounds as well, regional, some other kind of core passionate interests. But then once you do that, you open up this whole other can of worms, right? Where you're potentially preaching to the choir and not reaching people beyond that core audience. Or you might even become captured by that audience in some way and find it difficult to defy their expectations or challenge their own worldview and curiosity. So I wonder how you think about this as a leader of an important American and global news organization. How do you get out of this paradox of trying to expand the audience and think about reaching a broad public and defying people's expectations and challenging them, while at the same time actually sustaining yourself financially, which so many outlets really are struggling or failing to do?
This is one of the things that I love about being a non-commercial organization. People support us because we add value to their lives. People support us because they delight in the programming that NPR engages in. They find value in the journalism that NPR does. We're part of a network, as you mentioned, this is very unusual, of nearly 250 member stations around the country. And those member stations, we do the work of reporting with them. They represent the communities that they serve. They offer us the ability to co-report on major stories at the national level. And we have an election coming up, as everyone knows, and that is a tremendous opportunity to do really great work with these 250-ish local newsrooms around the country. So I think that is just such an advantage, but But what I was saying about it being non-commercial means that the way that the network works is that the public supports those local stations, and those local stations are part of who we are as NPR, which means that we are sustained by the value that people get out of the work that we do. So when people donate to their local member station, that is part of supporting the NPR network, that is part of supporting this reporting, and part of supporting all of the important programming. And that is such a unique differentiator, and this is why I think that many parts of the media ecosystem have identified the value of being a nonprofit newsroom. You don't have those same pressures of needing to provide a return. You can really focus on the service that you offer your community. It's just a very different nature of the beast in terms of the independence of what we offer, in terms of the ability to be really responsive to community needs, and have our only commitment, our only obligation be to serving that public trust.
Zooming out a little bit and thinking again about kind of the state of the journalistic landscape, I think it's pretty common today to paint a really harrowing picture of journalism in the United States, and it's not exclusive to the United States either. We've already talked about some of the financial challenges, and this is well beyond broadcast media. The numbers are astonishing for newspapers. Thousands of them have closed over a 20-year period. Most newsroom jobs in newspapers have disappeared in a 20-year period. We've talked also about the fragmentation across outlets, the loss of public trust. Maybe some of that is inevitable. Some of that could even be the fault of people making mistakes. Some of that is very cynical and purposefully fomented. And so we're just in a very polarized age where it just seems like if you add up all of this, it's a generational perfect storm for the industry of journalism. I think that's a very common narrative today, and it's depressing and it's challenging for democracy. And so maybe one question for you is that how you see it? Because you at least have the confidence to join NPR at this very febrile and difficult moment. So is that an accurate depiction of the media landscape today, or are there bright spots, new opportunities, creative experiments that you've either already seen at NPR or that you're seeing elsewhere or that we could be seeing, or is that basically right?
No, I'm not disheartened. One of the things I can sort of overwhelm you with numbers and statistics. We know that the average listener listens to 4 hours of listening a day, and that's been very consistent.
Wow.
I know it's a lot, right? I mean, and that includes different things. Sometimes that's entertainment, sometimes that's news, sometimes that is a blend of both, right? Some people get their news through forms of entertainment as well, and that's increasingly common. But we know that there's a real appetite and a real hunger from the public, from all of us, really, to understand the world around us and to understand the context in which we operate. We know, I just found out before walking on stage today that the trust of, and I'll speak for us, the trust in NPR among millennial and Gen Z audiences is actually a little bit higher than other segments of the population, and that is really exciting too, because I think we often write off younger generations as not being as interested in the news. We tend to think of, okay, well, there used to be the 5 or 6 o'clock broadcast shows, and that is an older audience, that's a boomer audience, perhaps, and that hasn't translated down to a younger generation, but we're not actually seeing that. I noticed that in our broadcast audiences, millennials actually ticked over Gen X in terms of their listening just very recently, and so I think that there is an interest, and that's just the sort of people who, I'll speak for myself, are a little bit middle-aged, right? If you go a generation down into Gen Z, there's a huge amount of news gathering and news listening and news engaging. It just looks different than it has in the past. It's not necessarily coming from the same perspective of having a newsroom, or if it does have a newsroom, it's just not a newsroom that looks like the type of newsroom that we have modeled our understandings off of based on movies like broadcast news or what have you. There's smaller groups of independent journalists who are working together and creating news. I know some of that has a particular slant or bias to it, and I think that is to be expected. It has always been the case that people seek information in some ways that reinforces their beliefs, but it's also the case that when you talk to news consumers today, very few of them rely just on one source. Most people, the actual information-seeking behavior is to compare and contrast. I think that it does a tremendous disservice to our fellow citizens, to the public, public to assume that people are only receiving information from one place. People are smart and they're engaged and they know how to cross-reference, and I know we'll talk a little bit about this. There's an intuitive media literacy that exists in the up-and-coming generation and the millennial generation, in the Gen X generation, about how you actually consume news now that the landscape is so different than it was when we just had a few major broadcast channels. And so I'm not negative about this at all. I think it's a huge opportunity and it's an exciting opportunity to speak in different ways to audiences that have been looking for this and have a desire to find something that they trust, even if they augment it with all sorts of other sources.
I'm glad you brought up media literacy. I want to just make a brief comment on that before I circle back to some of the threads that you just pulled. In our research on disinformation, civic trust, improving the information environment, in addition to investing in local news, investing in media literacy, again, seems to be one of the interventions that probably has the most promise. It's long-term, it can be costly, and we know that media literacy today looks very different than it might have looked 10 or 20 years ago. You need to teach very different skills. You might even need to teach an emotional reaction to news and information where you can actually encourage people to have a sense of responsibility and the prospect that they could succeed, that they could successfully navigate the information environment actually seems to be really key.
Yeah.
And not just skills development. Just to circle back to, I think, a couple of ideas here. One of the terms that has come up a lot recently is news avoidance. And I think we all know people in our lives, especially if we're news junkies, some of us might find this astonishing, but it is commonplace to say, the news is depressing, the news gives me anxiety, there's nothing that I can do about it. So I actually have an audience question here about how you think about the non-news content. People are mentioning, I have Tiny Desk concerts, local music DJ that comes on every day at NPR affiliates. NPR is not just news, it's also entertainment and non-news content. And so what's the interplay there between news and non-news? Is this a way of, accessing people who might have that news avoidance tendency, or just even beyond the news? What is there a role for in this questioner is asking about community building and trust in public institutions?
Oh, I have to say, is this questioner one of our Tiny Desk colleagues? No.
I don't know.
I think that, I just love that you bring this up, because I think that actually in some ways, I was just talking to our international correspondents and they made the point that, they will go all over the world. We've got 17 foreign bureaus. It's an absolutely remarkable commitment that NPR has to covering the world on behalf of, the public trust here in America. And they are some of the hardest working journalists in the business. And I just want to take a moment to actually say that, because they have been shot at, they have been operating in war zones. They are doing incredible work to make sure that when you turn on the radio or you open your podcast, you have an understanding of what's happening in the world from a very human perspective, which I think is something that audio offers, but also our correspondents do so well. Okay, so that's my soapbox on our international correspondents. The thing that they mentioned about Tiny Desk is no matter where they go in the world, even if people, NPR is an English language, primarily English, Spanish programming, people recognize the 3 letters of NPR and they come up and they say Tiny Desk. There is such an incredible universality to music, right? And there's such an incredible universality to culture. And so what is the interplay there? Well, we were established as public broadcasting not just to provide journalism. We were established as public broadcasting to inform the American public. And part of that is also ensuring that we're thinking about the cultural lifeblood of this nation. This is actually one of the things that I find so exciting about our local stations as well, and something that we know to really be true, is that some of the most, we were talking about this just before coming on stage, one of the most popular shows that NPR has ever hosted was Click and Clack, the Tappert Brothers, Car Talk, right? I know that I'm dating myself a little bit, but does anybody else remember Car Talk? Does anybody else learn how cars work from Car Talk? Yeah. So Car Talk still has a very robust back archive, but one of the things about that is the Boston accents of the Car Talk participants. And so, that regionality that we are able to offer through programming, like Car Talk, certainly, like Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, which comes out of Chicago, NPR Music, which is able to highlight voices from all over our country. It's about elevating and stitching together this sense of a common public that public media serves. But it also is a way of inviting people in, right? Maybe it isn't that you start your day by listening, as you said, as a news junkie to what's happening on Capitol Hill or what's happening in Ukraine. Maybe it's that you start your day by wanting a little inspiration and a little excitement and a little joy. Our research has been incredibly consistent that people who listen to NPR listen in part and want that moment of joy. They want that moment of human connection, and that human connection can come in all different forms. So the stronger that we are at connecting that, whether that is, Jazz Night in America, which is one of the programs that is incredibly well respected and popular among jazz aficionados. We have really exciting work that we've done around bluegrass and elevating forms of regional music in this country. That is a way of touching on the fact that we have a common cultural thread that can be interwoven. And that maybe is an introduction then, of course, to the way that we do local journalism. And local journalism can be a step up to national journalism in terms of transferring that trust and understanding of what public media can actually be in people's lives.
I'd love to ask you about the digital and the technology side of this. You're only 4 weeks into NPR, but you spent, I think, 7 years running the Wikimedia Foundation. And when I asked before about—
7 years there, 5 years running.
Okay, great, thanks.
Facts.
Yep. No disinformation from this stage.
No disinformation, yep.
When I asked you about kind of bright spots in the information landscape, I think anyone should say that Wikipedia is a bright spot. It's hard to remember now how many doubters it had within the kind of establishmentarian sphere. Yeah, right. I mean, you were there. A lot of people thought it didn't make sense, it wouldn't be accurate, you couldn't sustain a volunteer ecosystem or be popular. So going back to that puzzle of how do you actually have truthful, broad-minded content while also being popular, Wikipedia has somehow managed to be the only, I think, nonprofit in the top 50 most visited sites on the internet, and is now being used by so many other services who are looking for grounded truth in an era of generative AI and so on and so forth. So what did you learn from that? Insofar as that's a success story of the liberating possibilities of information in the digital age, what are the lessons that others can learn from that, and particularly that you bring to NPR and the journalistic sphere?
Yeah, so I mean, part of it is that Wikipedia offers, well, there's so much to talk about with Wikipedia, right? And we would always say that, as I said, we start from the position that we're transparent about where we're accurate and where we're not. We start from the position that when we make mistakes, we're very open about that with the public so that people have the ability to decide whether they trust us or not. We remind everyone to check the citations, and those citations go back to secondary sources. And there's a whole process of vetting those secondary sources. Is there an editorial process? Do they issue corrections when they have mistakes? I think that is, are they well respected in their field? So if we're talking about, for example, medical journals, are they sort of seen as credible? Because you can't build a house upon sort of a shoddy foundation, and the foundation of that is the broader information ecosystem. So we start from that position of saying, we have to earn your trust every single day. We have to earn your trust. We have to be transparent about the way that we do the work. We have to be transparent about the policies that inform this. I have to say NPR is very, very similar in this regard. Transparent policies, works every story every day to earn your trust, has a public editor to help us understand that who is independent. We're one of the only newsrooms in the country that does that, who responds to questions about the public, about our choices of programming. So that was one piece of Wikipedia. The other piece is bringing people into dialogue and into conversation. I mentioned earlier that there's been this research that you can take people of widely opposing viewpoints, particularly sort of in the political space, and bring them into dialogue with each other and editing together. And by the end of the day, their contributions and their commitment as they continue to participate in the Wikipedia ecosystem becomes more constructive and more engaged. So you actually find consensus on the internet, which is not a thing that happens very often. And I think it's a really powerful reminder that we can have totally different views, but when we actually bring them together into dialogue, we can get a result that is much more accurate and much more representative because we're actually reckoning with what each other is bringing to the table, and we're asking the difficult questions that need to be asked. So that's a really big piece of it too. The best Wikipedia articles are often the ones that you would think are the most contentious. They're about world leaders, they're about major historical events. And those articles are robust, they're well cited, they're heavily debated and engaged with. And if there's ever a disagreement that can't be resolved, the editors pause and they stop on the latest version that everyone can agree on before moving to updating. And I think that we can talk a little bit about how that plays out in the disinformation space, but I think that's a really important lesson to be learned about how do we engage and find sort of common points of reference and consensus. And then the last thing that I'll say is that, I mean, a couple different things. Part of that trust comes too from knowing that you have to have really good coverage about everything. So you have to have really good coverage about, Beyonce's new album, as well as really good coverage about your local hometown, as well as really good coverage about the current sitting members of Congress. Because if the coverage about the album isn't good, then somebody who enters into that point, and this sort of gets back to Tiny Desk too, right? If somebody who enters into the conversation being interested in something that Beyonce has just released, they don't think that's good, they're not going to go on to the next article. So you have to be really consistent and also really humble about understanding what people's information needs are. And if you can meet those needs very consistently over time, you build a tremendous amount of trust and credibility. We used to say that the first article that everyone would always start at is your hometown, right? I mean, I don't know that that's still the case, but when you think about where Wikipedia came from when it was first being built out, you would go and look at your article about your hometown. Kind of curious, is my hometown on the map? What does it say? Do I have local heroes? Christine Lilly, big soccer player, America Olympic team is from my hometown. I saw that. That was exciting. I knew that that was correct. We have a soccer field named after her. So you go to the article about your hometown, if it's reasonably good, there's transitive trust to the next article. And so when we think about building a web of trust and the information ecosystem, there's actually really big lessons to be learned here. It turns out that stronger interlinking, more local journalism, so when sites that are doing reporting link back to each other across the information environment. So, and this is a place where public media is really good at this. I can say that maybe we didn't break the story, but somebody else broke the story, so we'll put the link there. Not all commercial sites do this. That helps weave in a network of information that helps increase confidence. Local journalism helps increase confidence. We have news deserts. We have to address that if we're going to continue to build trust so that people can make their own determinations and understand, what is important to them in their operating environment.
I want to ask a couple final questions about kind of looking ahead and where everything is going with technology and with politics, and how this intersects with journalistic institution. And then hit some more audience questions. Again, members of the audience, please keep the questions coming. The more, the better. So, generative AI.
Yeah.
I've been doing tech policy for a while. It's hard to imagine, it's hard to remember a time when there has been more hype and fear about any particular technology. Now, it's relevant to this conversation because it's an information technology. It's a technology fundamentally about producing content. So there's a lot of fears out there about it, about inaccurate hallucinations. From the media perspective, you get institutions like New York Times and others who are worried about it being trained on unauthorized reproductions of copyrighted content or being able to reproduce that copyrighted content without unauthorization. And then lots of fears about how it will disrupt the way that people access information and the business models, which has been a key theme today, of the financial sustainability of the people actually producing high quality information that these algorithms are trained on. On the other hand, there's a lot of people who are a lot more hopeful as well, and who see generative AI and other AI tools as a kind of general purpose cognitive enhancer, a tool that any researcher, writer, analyst, including journalists, could use to make their work more efficient, productive, surface leads and ideas. So you're now running an organization that I'm sure is going to be wrestling with these questions of, do you embrace generative AI? Do you do so tentatively? Do you go all in and try to stay ahead of the curve? How are you thinking about that at this early moment of your leadership?
It's a great question. And in part because it's so rich and complex. And so I don't know that I have sort of a single thought about this. What I will say is that in 2019, before ChatGPT and all of the ways that we currently think about the transformational power of generative AI, at Wikipedia, we were already being used as a major training database for a lot of this, right? Because we have articles that are written by people, we have a very human voice. And so a lot of the large language models were being trained on Wikipedia's information. And so I wrote a piece at that time that was in the New York Times, it was an op-ed, that talked about the importance of having humans in the loop. And when we think about the deployment of AI on Wikipedia, what we always thought about was, look, it should do tasks that can be better done by AI so that humans can do tasks that are better done by humans. We have editorial judgment. We have the ability to have difficult conversations. We have the ability to weigh trade-offs in terms of the decision-making from an editorial process. And so what we always focused on doing was giving, our editors the chance to be able to decide whether they wanted to use AI, being really transparent about where it was being used, making sure that it was a sort of tool that did not interfere with a reader's ability to discern information. So we weren't offering articles up based on what we thought you wanted. That always was very much about the ability of an individual to consume and discover information as they needed. I think those are very similar principles that I would consider in the newsroom. There has to be a human in the loop. It has to be additive and augmentative to the tasks that people already do really well. It should never come between a listener or a reader or a citizen, however you want to think about our audience, and the work that we do. It should always be very transparent about how we use it. We should have really strong guidelines, and those guidelines should be audited all the time, and they should be public. So, I mean, those are some of the ways that I think about it. In terms of how the newsroom is currently using this, I know they're reporting on the way that AI is transforming potentially our economy, our information landscape, thinking about questions of information quality and integrity. And in terms of deployment, I know that we've spun up an AI lab that I haven't yet had the chance to go check out. So again, it's mostly coming from where do I think the values are relative to public service, relative to transparency, and relative to trust.
Great. Okay. Last question from me about the election. Can't avoid it. We're in a very sensitive period politically. It's an unprecedented election in so many ways. We've gone now through several election cycles where the media has really been in the spotlight, and people on all sides are really asking tough questions about the role of the media during elections, how it can behave responsibly. Do we need a new rule book for the media? Do we need new organizational strategies? So I just wonder, maybe because you're not in the editorial process, thinking at a more strategic level, what do you hope NPR can contribute to the public conversation around election 2024? And maybe one way of posing the question is, when all is said and done and everyone has voted and the outcome is known and the conversations are over, what do you hope to look back and be able to say about how NPR performed, what it achieved, your goals, in essence, for the election?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love that you said all sides. I think that that's so important. We start from the position in our work and in our reporting that no single person can be reduced to a single belief. People come to the table with very complex and nuanced perspectives. Sometimes they can hold contradictory perspectives. I know I hold contradictory perspectives at times. It's important for us to see the totality of people. And there's an expression, actually comes out of literature, comes out of James Joyce, right? That the specific is actually the universal. And so I think that the more that we're able to tell the stories of individual voters, the more that we're able to tell the stories of individual priorities and issues and individual candidates, that is actually the sort of thing that is going to be much more meaningful in terms of our ability to report and report well and be in service to the public. We talked, as you said, this is not my world. So I'm going to tell you what our newsroom is focused on, which is about the voters, the vote, and the issues, making sure that we're really thinking about how we're covering the priorities of Americans, how we're covering the issues that people care about, how we're covering the election itself. I think that what didn't come up yet in our conversation, but in the context of information trust, is the more that people understand in advance of an issue, about an issue, the more confidence they have in the outcome after that moment has passed, after that event has actually happened. It's giving people awareness about, about what the context is going into the vote. It's about giving awareness about what the events are going into the vote. It's about performing that service well. It's about leveraging the nearly 250 newsrooms that we have so that we're reporting on the issues that Americans care about in every part of the country, and we're really speaking to that. I was talking to one of our reporters the other day who made the point that in where he's from, it's such an immediate tell if you don't pronounce the name of the county that he's from right. And we all have these, right? Sure. I mean, we all come from places and we all have regionalisms and we all have knowledge about the communities that we're from. So really leaning into that and being able to uplift all those stories really well. we talked, there's a sort of statement of principles that one of our editors was speaking about I think clarity, rigor, and creativity. And I think that really speaks to it. Let's be really clear about the issues. Let's be really rigorous about the facts. Let's be really fair, and let's be creative about understanding what it is that Americans need so that we can tell the stories and report on the stories in ways that really gets to the heart of what people are interested in.
Great. So I'm looking at some of the audience questions here. There's several that are on this theme of disinformation and kind of how it's tackled at NPR. And several of them are framed in terms of this Uri Berliner essay and kind of what can be learned from it. So, I know you're not editing articles, you're not directly responsible for ensuring that a specific article or news story goes out that is fair and balanced. But one of the questions is about how do you, as a manager and leader, send the right signal to your employee base about what they can do about their internal concerns, right?
Yeah,
So
I think that's so important.
Uri,
I'm so glad you raised it.
as we know, he went public with his concerns, ended up being suspended. He's now resigned, we've learned today. So what's the message to your staff about how they can actually have their concerns heard in a meaningful way without fear of reprisal?
Yeah, and I read Uri's letter, and I never had the chance to meet him personally. And I wish, in some ways, that I had that chance so that we could have talked about what his concerns were. I mean, again, I don't have any editorial guidance on the newsroom, but it would have been interesting to hear and be able to think about structurally, what can we do? So two of the things that I already talked about audience research, that's a big priority for us, understanding what it is that Americans need, understanding all the news needs of all Americans, because as I said, that is our public mandate. But two things that I did right away in coming in was set up a quarterly editorial meeting, which brings in our member stations. So I mentioned there's nearly 250 newsrooms that have a real pulse on what's going on in their communities to participate in the editorial process, to make sure that we're covering the right range of issues that speaks to the wide variety of people in this nation and their beliefs and their needs and their interests, and that we're doing that in a way that feels as though it's fair and it's representative, and we're able to serve all of those audiences, sort of without fear or favor. The other thing was setting up a monthly newsroom meeting where we're able to take a look at what the coverage has been, looking back over the course of the past month, and how are we covering certain topics? Do we have enough balance around certain issues? Are we thinking about, have we leaned a little heavily on one topic over the course of the month? Maybe because it's in the news. Maybe it's in the news. We're the news. Maybe because it's breaking news. Maybe because it's something that's actively happening. But are we also taking a break to say, well, what aren't we covering, and what are the issues that need to be in here as well? So those are two things just right off the bat to think about. How do we look holistically and make sure that we are ensuring a really wide range of perspectives and views? I think another piece of that is making sure we have active and robust debate in the newsroom from a wide variety of perspectives, so that those conversations are being had. Again, that is something that is a newsroom leadership imperative, but giving people the ability to feel as though that those conversations are welcomed, creating a culture where those conversations are welcomed, those are incredibly important priorities for us in order to be of service to the widest number of people. I think, of course, it's always the best way to bring up issues is to have these conversations with our colleagues. I was not there over the course of the previous few years. I don't know, what happened or didn't happen. I can't speak to that, but I know that there's a real appetite internally within our newsroom to have these conversations. We want to have them. We want to know how to be accountable, how to be better, how to serve the American public as well as it deserves to be served.
And I think your point about newsroom debate is really essential and cuts to the heart of some of what people are discussing about journalism and NPR today. One notion that's come up is viewpoint diversity, and basically having enough viewpoint diversity in a newsroom that those debates occur, are meaningful, feel comfortable for people. Is that kind of diversity something that you track or should track internally? Or how do you get a handle on whether those things are actually happening or not?
I think that's reflected in the stories, right? I think that's reflected in what is the audience that we serve and how much value do they get out of our work. Tracking individual viewpoints, I mean, this is the thing about journalism, is that of course, people come from all sorts of backgrounds. They have different lived experiences, but they come to the table to do the work and uphold journalistic ethics and integrity. And that means reporting stories based on the facts. That means reporting stories that matter. That means ensuring that we're rigorous with our sourcing. That means ensuring that we are focused on delivering what is accurate and what we know about the world today, and then updating it again, right? Because the news is constantly changing, and we're going to constantly need to follow those stories to make sure that we're really doing it well. Now, that is what the most important work of journalism actually is. Are we covering the stories from a wide enough variety of perspectives? Is it reflected in how well the audience feels served? Do we have a wide enough audience that is representative of our nation? And so that, I think, is the priority, and that's actually the way that we should be thinking about this.
Another question about disinformation, and it's circling back to some of our opening remarks about how do you define it. So this questioner says, it strikes me that sometimes the lines between disinformation and genuinely contested narratives or evidence are quite blurry. They use the example of the effectiveness of different COVID response policies. So I think this is something that all of us in this field need to wrestle with, but the questioner is asking, how do you at NPR ensure that efforts to fight disinformation don't inadvertently cut off genuine debate and discussion, which could actually even feed further conspiracy theories about what they don't want you to know, is the question.
Yeah, I think that the focus of our work really is around how do we cover the topics that are the topic of the topic of disinformation in a really clear way. Now, I agree with you that that word is really tough, and I don't love it either. I don't think it's a great word, but it's the word that we have, right?
Yeah.
And I think that generally speaking, the way that folks that you're like yourself, and you are much more the expert in this from an academic standpoint, define this is largely around sort of coordinated campaigns to mislead. Right? Is that how you would largely define disinformation with some sort of outcome?
Yeah, I
or
think
objective?
often, false information intended to deceive, and it could often be a coordinated campaign. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So for the most part, we're not actively fighting that in the newsroom. What we're doing is we're covering it as from a journalistic perspective, in the sense of what's out there, what do people need to know, what are the experts like yourself telling us, and making sure that we're really rigorous about that in terms of our work. And so we do have a team that covers this, but they definitely cover it from the perspective of a news organization rather than working on disinformation internally.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it gets to, I think one of the things that's lost with that term disinformation is it imagines that everything is just clear cut between true and false. And actually, in my experience, conversations around media bias or objectivity, they're often not about clearly factually false things that the media are just misreporting. It's more about framing, story selection, emphasis, which voices are higher and lower in an article. I mean, is that kind of part of the picture of what fairness looks like for NPR? And how do you monitor something so debatable and resistant to quantification, but that often is getting at the crux of what people are concerned about when they perceive media bias or a lack of objectivity?
I think this is where, again, not leading the newsroom, I'm going to come back to how do we serve America? How do we serve America? Are we serving audiences from across the country? Right now, as I said, we serve more than 40 million Americans. We serve more than 99% of the country is covered by a public media broadcast signal. We know that we have audiences from every corner. Country's not square, I don't know why I say that, every corner of the country, right? And so are we serving them well?
Yeah.
Are we growing our audiences? Do people feel as though this is an actual service in their lives? And does that represent the wide variety of Americans that make up our country today? I think that if we look at that, that is so much more representative of how are we doing our job than thinking about, like, from my perspective, because I'm not in the newsroom, that is very much up to our standards and practices editor. That is very much up to our individual editors, and that's their responsibility to take on a day-by-day basis.
Why don't we end on this question? And I think it cuts at your role as CEO. The question is, what are the management principles and leadership principles and lessons that you plan to bring to this job? And I think one thing on my mind when I read this question is what we've seen not only at NPR, but many, many other news organizations, is there's internal disagreement about how the news should be reported. And increasingly, we do see many news organizations, New York Times, NBC, Washington Post, and others, these internal debates between different factions, interest groups, generations, they actually are spilling into public view and creating more and more intense demands on leaders to be a broker of different points of view on news. So as you're facing down all of that, including in this moment, there's a question about where do you look for inspiration in terms of organizational and management perspectives, newsrooms or other organizations that you feel are handling this well, or how you hope to handle these challenges?
I think that humility is actually the most important quality of any leader, of being open to when we get it wrong, being open to self-scrutiny, being able to ask ourselves the questions of how do we do better. That is, I think that starts at the top, and that is why, the first thing that is important to me is understanding who are we serving. That's where the focus on audiences came from. That's where the focus on being committed to working with our member stations comes from, is what are we doing right? What are we not doing as well as we could? And how do we get better at what we do? And where can we learn? And I think that good ideas can come from all comers. One of the things that I said to the organization was that a mission that is successful and this is about leadership, a mission that is successful in the world, that is enduring and meaningful, is one that is held widely outside your own institution, right? And so we heard talk a little bit at the top about the mission of this organization and institution. And I would say that your mission is very widely shared by many others in the world. It's why you have donors and supporters. It's why you do the work that you do. I believe that our mission is very widely shared in the world too, and that's about listening to your strongest allies, and it's about listening to your most loyal opposition, because they're deeply invested in your mission, and there's always